Full screen. My name is Paweł Mirski. I'm from northeastern Poland, and I would like to talk today about Montagus Harriers that are breeding in my region, and those are two different populations. One is breeding in crops. The more common population is the crop breeding population, but we also have a population that is breeding in large natural wetlands, and I would like to talk about some experience from working with those two populations. And results I'll be talking about were not designed as a study, but it's rather a post-field working experience with those two different populations. And the field works were carried out in course of the project that Dominic was already presenting. So this was the same project carried out in 2017-2020. So let's start with the fact that Montagus Harrier in Poland was for over a century was regarded as a meadow harrier, so a meadow species. This Polish name was just a meadow harrier, and our great pioneer of ornithology, Władysław Tachanowski, wrote about Montagus Harrier already in the 19th century, that it's breeding, that in breeding time it stays more over vast grasslands and wetlands than over dry and open fields, and in contrary to hen harrier, it is never nesting in crops. So for over a century, this was really wetlands, natural grassland species that didn't nest in the crops. But from the beginning of 80s and especially in the 90s, it was noticed as a regular breeder in crops afterwards. Sorry. So, as my colleagues already said, Polish Montagus Harrier population is decreasing, and it's decreasing quite fast. But the decline of the wetland population is even visibly sharper, because we had some Nature 2000 sites where Montagus Harrier was a target species, and standard data from formulas from Nature 2000 areas showed quite nice populations in the 90s, even in the beginning of this century. But inventories done in 2013 and 2014 showed that those populations are actually vanishing or even vanished, except for one population, which was estimated as 97 pairs, maybe in the 90s, but now it's smaller. But this is the population in Bieber Valley, our largest national park in Poland, the Nature 2000 site of quite a great area. This is the main stronghold of rare wetland bird species such as aquatic warbler or greater spotted eagle, the main stronghold in the European Union. And in its open landscape, it is comprised mostly of reed, sedge, and shrub communities. And we were happy, together with my colleagues, we were very happy to work in this area to monitor Montagus Harriers population and breeding parameters in course of this particular project aim and project task. But parallel to the study in Bieber marshes, we were also conducting active nest conservation in Wysokie Mazowieckie County. So this is Bieber marshes, and south of it we have a typical agricultural landscape, maybe typical for eastern Poland. So it's rather open, not too much afforested, and it is comprised of quite intensively managed nowadays landscape, in a quite intensive farmland landscape, but in very mosaic pattern. So small patches and very mosaic. Especially if you would compare this agricultural landscape to the wetlands, with the same scale. So agriculture is very mosaic, and the nesting habitats are, as my colleagues said already, the same. So this is This is mostly cereals, but also managed grasslands and rape. While in the wetlands, the dynastic habitats are different types of sedges and reed communities. So like sparse reed or very dense 2 meters reed, and clump sedges and sedges like here also, so dense sedges. Although the species is the same, and the distance between those populations reach only 20 to 30 kilometers from the nearest nests, the landscape is completely different, and we had to work also a little bit different way. So our field working methods were a little bit different, and our aims were also different, because in this agricultural landscape, our task was to conduct nest conservation. So we were mostly focused on the nests that were threatened by harvesting, while in Bieber marshes the landscape was very different. Our methods were different. It is the least accessible, I think, site in Poland in the lowlands. So our methods were also different. There was more field work. The field working effort was greater, and our aims were also different, because we were not conducting conservation at all. We were just monitoring. So we were observers that looked for nests, estimate the population size and breeding parameters. We are not conducting conservation at all. Okay, and those are two quite large areas. So we can talk about landscape scale differences between those two areas. And agricultural landscape, of course, is rather dry. It is managed landscape, so it has to be very accessible. So it's rather dry, and water level shows limited dynamics. So sometimes heavy rainfalls, of course, can cause some dynamics. But in wetland landscape, we can observe seasonal and interannual dynamics, because there were some dry years, like especially recently, but also some wet years at the beginning in 2017, but also like this year 2020, we had some interannual dynamics, because there were heavy rainfalls in the end of June, and the water level very quickly rised, which was not observed in agricultural landscape. Vegetation in agricultural landscape is low at the arrival time. So Harriers arrive, and there are no ready patches to breed, and the growth of the vegetation, especially growth of cereals, may be further delayed by the weather, like Dominic said, by the cold springs, like in 2017. While in the marshes, in those wetlands, vegetation is mostly suitable at the arrival time. So there are, of course, quite large areas that are mowed, and in the end of the year, but most of the areas are mowed in like 2 years or even 4 years regime. So once per 4 or once per 2 years, and some patches are not mowed at all. So there are there are patches of available high vegetation. Those are like large patches, like dozens or hundreds of hectares per site. Mowing and harvesting in agricultural landscape coincides with nesting phenology of Montagus Harrier very often. Especially grassland mowing is managed grasslands are mowed always during Montagus Harrier incubation, or at least chick rearing, but usually at incubation. Harvesting can coincide or with chick stage or not. Depends on particular nest advancement, chick advancement. But in the wetlands, there are very rare cases, like once per season maybe we observe that the grasslands where Montagus Harriers were breeding was mowed. So wetlands are usually mowed in September, or even not at all in many sites. So some private grasslands may be mowed earlier. prey in agricultural landscape, as we showed a few years ago, is rather variable, so it's moderately abundant. Those places are not very abundant in voles, but the variability of prey is quite high. While in the wetland landscape, the prey is variable for sure, and the rodents show quite pronounced cyclic changes. So there are years of vole abundance and years of where voles are not abundant at all, and we observe more of alternative prey at that time. And one important, very important, maybe difference between agricultural landscape and wetland landscape is that in agricultural landscape, the predator's guild is very reduced. So we have few other birds of prey species and of course a fox or some domestic animals, while in the wetland landscape, we have really variable mammalian and avian predators guilds. So not only variable, but in some cases also very abundant. Some avian predators and mammal predators can be also very abundant. And the difference in vegetation induces also some important nesting phenology differences between agriculture and wetlands. So in wetlands, Harriers, Montagus Harriers arrive from half of April, and in first days of May, we observe most of pairs already formed or displaying and even starting nest building, like just in the first days of May. And chicks fledge earlier than in the agricultural landscape, because in first half of June, most of nests have already some chicks hatched, or all of them hatched. Why broads are very rarely repeated in the marshes. Maybe those pairs are repeating the broads, who knows, but not in the marshes. We have seen like very single exceptional cases of repeating the broads in the marshes. While in the agricultural landscape, the arrival starts from end of May to almost from end of April to almost end of May. And territorial displays are carried out very often in May. We look for Harriers in their like usual regular breeding sites, and sometimes in some sites where the vegetation is low, there are no Harriers in May, but suddenly at the end of May, like the first decade of May, suddenly there are 4 pairs which were not present before. So either they change the places or wait for the vegetation, or they are also arriving later, and some males with the satellite with GPS tags we were following were arriving just like 20 May or something. And of course, there is a high broad asynchrony between pairs nesting in different crops in different habitats, and even we observe quite a lot of broads with second calendar year old females and some repeated broads that are usually very late, and like even like this year, some eggs were laid just in July and chicks were fledging on the break of August and September. It was exceptionally late, but very late. Breeding is quite common each year, not in high numbers, but in small numbers. Okay, so Montagus Harrier numbers differed in both populations, but in the wetland populations, it seems that the population vary more in terms of their numbers, especially depending on the water level and voles abundance. Especially the water level may be crucial at the beginning of the season, because it's simply when there's high water level in the spring, so there is a lack of dry places to breed for Montagus Harriers, and in contrary to marsh harrier, the nests that are built by Montagus Harrier are really small and flat, so they cannot compete too much with the rising water level. So especially the first year, that was the quite humid, quite wet, showed smaller number of pairs, but last 2 years that were dry and abundant in voles showed higher number of pairs in Bieber marshes, while in agricultural landscape there is some dynamic, but not that easily interpreted in terms of water levels and fall cycles. So we found rather moderate number of nests per season, and protected like at least half of it in the agricultural landscape, but didn't interfere at all in the wetland landscape. Okay, breeding parameters. So Montagus Harriers were more optimistic in the wetland population because they laid more eggs. Somehow they laid more eggs, but number of chicks per clutch was rather comparable. Numbers of chicks fledged was very comparable between agricultural land and between farmland and wetlands. However, the breeding success was visibly greater. The annual breeding success was visibly greater in agricultural landscape, where we have conducted the conservation measures. So probably this is the main reason. Otherwise, it could be maybe similar, but who knows? We don't have control without the conservation tasks. So the most important thing maybe for us in terms of conservation, in the light of conservation of Montagus Harrier, what are the reasons of broad losses? And I have to mention that we search for nests in the spring, and we are mapping territories in the spring, and there is this great pause when we start to look for the nest when the chicks are already hatched. So meantime, lots of pairs just disappear. One third of pairs just 2/3 of pairs just disappear. So the agricultural practices in the spring and some other things are going on. So we are tracking like 1/3 of the nests that survive to chick stage. Unfortunately, on wetlands we try to search for the nests earlier even, so we have more nests at the chick stage. And what is visible here that farming practices, especially in this even in the chick stage, especially at the managed grasslands, the mowing has tremendous effect on breeding success, but the predation, what I would like to pronounce here, predation here was very small. We had some single cases of predation at the chick stage already on the nest we found, but not necessarily fenced at the beginning. So fencing was only partly involved in increasing the survival of the nests. But in the wetlands, we had quite a lot of, not quite a lot of even, very high numbers of predation in both mammalian and avian, but usually mammalian predation. And in some years also flooding was important, like in 2020. But 69% of nests are predated. Depends on the year. There are in the year 2019, where there was quite high vole abundance and it was quite dry. I think foxes were more interested in the voles than to search for the scarce nests of Montagus Harrier. But the mean is like 69% of known broad losses were predation. And so predators' guilt is quite variable, but there are two particular species that commonly predate Montagus Harrier's nests, and this is raccoon dog, and red fox. And sometimes we even marsh harrier, although they are neighboring commonly, and the very rare greater spotted eagle. Yeah, this is a nice species that I was working also with. So sometimes I'm not too sad if greater spotted eagle is eating Montagus Harrier, which is much more common species, but never mind. So combining the experience And from those two populations, I think large grassland areas, which previously held important Montagus Harrier populations, may suffer from both major reasons of broad losses. So agricultural practices, like in terms of those managed grasslands, is mowing 2 to 3 times per season, and increased predation, because this were semi-natural grasslands, very often quite vast grasslands on drained marshes. So there is the predators killed are is quite variable and quite abundant also here. So when we have those two main broad losses regions combined in those managed grasslands, we have very low breeding success that caused those populations to extinct. Although this first population is quite unique, because those are grasslands those are wetlands that are not managed, but also vanished, but their size is like 15 times smaller than than Bieber marshes. So also the important thing is probably the important reason of this population vanishing is what is on the outskirts, what is outside those wetlands, because they were not used for foraging rather, but mostly for breeding. And finally, one more important difference between agricultural and wetland population is the space use of Montagus Harrier males, at least because we studied males here. And we have studied few males. We have a limited sample size of few males from agriculture, from wetland population, and some more from agricultural landscape. But here I'm presenting only the ones from the neighboring population from Wysoko-Mazowiecki region, and we can see that home ranges of Montagus Harriers on wetlands are visibly greater than those in this agricultural mosaic south of this region. So we can tell that